Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and you're listening to The Business of Content, a podcast about how publishers create, distribute, and monetize their digital content. For this week's episode, I interviewed a newsletter consultant who generated over 25,000 subscribers for his own creator-focused newsletter. Josh Spector was blogging before most people even knew what a blog was. Over the span of a decade, he started and abandoned several of them, often before they had a chance to amass much of an audience. But in 2011, he got more serious about audience growth for a blog he ran that focused on teaching stand-up comedians how to market themselves, and to help drive traffic to it, he launched a newsletter. Pretty quickly, he grew addicted to the newsletter medium, and a few years later, he merged a couple of newsletters he was running into a single list and renamed it For the Interested. Since 2016, he's been sending out new issues each week featuring ideas to help creators to produce, promote, and profit from their creations. For the Interested now has over 25,000 subscribers, and Josh recently launched a paid spin-off newsletter. I recently interviewed Josh about how he grew his audience, the role his newsletter plays in his consulting business, and why he thinks so many writers are approaching paid newsletters the wrong way. Before we jump into the interview, I want to talk about a case study I published to my newsletter. I interviewed the founder of AmazingRibs.com, a thriving barbecue website that generates significant revenue through affiliate links contained within product reviews. I interviewed the founder about how he designed his product review process, who seeks out the site's reviews, and why his affiliate revenue has decreased in recent years. There's only one way to access this interview, by becoming a subscriber to my Substack newsletter. By becoming a subscriber, you not only gain access to media industry insights that will help you in your career, you'll also help support this podcast. This podcast is not yet sustainable, and the only way to guarantee that I keep putting out new episodes is to subscribe. To do so, go to simonowens.substack.com. That's simonowens.substack.com. Or just Google the words Simon Owens and newsletter. Okay, now on to my interview with Josh. Hey Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So your most successful publishing project to date has been this newsletter you run called For the Interested. But you actually had a long, circuitous path launching various blogs and newsletters. You launched your first blog in like the early 2000s, right?
It was, I think it's funny. It was on Blogger, and it was, I don't know the exact date. It's funny because back then I would start a blog and publish on it all pretty much anonymously, by the way. I wasn't yet comfortable having my name out there, but I would publish on it for a couple months and then inevitably abandon it or start a new one. And so, but yeah, I think it was, I don't know the exact date, but I would guess it was 2000-ish. It was early enough that a lot of people, probably most people, didn't even know what a blog was. And the ones that had heard the term, there certainly was not a lot of respect for it. It was kind of considered a ridiculous thing. I mean, it was so early that I think it was before you definitely couldn't embed video. And I don't think you could really, at that point, Blogger didn't even have like simple image upload functionality. So I remember
Yeah, I remember back in the early days of blogging, like you had to go to like PhotoBucket and upload like some kind of hosting service like that, and then embed the link in your blog if you wanted to have an image. Like these websites didn't allow you to just upload an image to the actual blog itself.
So I mean, most of my posts at the time were basically just, some version of, oh, here's an interesting article I read in Sports Illustrated with a link or, whatever. Like it certainly was a lot different than what it's become.
And so that was like in the early 2000s. You eventually, over the years, you said you launched several blogs. You kind of landed on one that was a little bit more modern on this blog that helps comedians promote themselves. Why was that a subject that interested you?
So what had happened is I was working. I was working at New Line Cinema in marketing, but on the side, I had a production company and was starting to produce. I got into the comedy world and started to produce live stand-up shows and some stand-up tours. And this was around the time that MySpace, it was sort of pre-Facebook. It was when MySpace was big. And so all these comics were just starting to use social media. They were starting to have MySpace profiles, and Dane Cook had become huge. And And MySpace had built-in blogging functionality, so they were blogging a little bit, and they were just, it's early YouTube. They're just starting to make videos. And I had developed relationships with a lot of these up-and-coming comedians. And what I started to realize was I launched a separate blog or website, and I would literally just curate and feature, oh, here's a funny blog post that this comic wrote. Here's a video that this comic wrote. And in the process of doing that, I sort of learned, it was the first time I really was paying attention to sort of starting to grow an audience and learning how you could use social media and blogging and writing and newsletters to sort of grow an audience. And I think the real kind of aha moment for me was, so I was doing this while simultaneously trying to produce TV shows and get meetings with places like Comedy Central, and not getting anywhere with it. And what I found out, months later, was that there were development executives at Comedy Central who were reading my blog and using it to find talent, and yet I couldn't get meetings with anybody. And it made me realize that, these digital tools are sort of a shortcut or an end around beyond sort of the gatekeeper system, that you could kind of go straight to both audiences, but also even industry. And that really kind of excited me. And I started to get deeper and deeper into social media and audience growth and all this stuff. And then eventually launched what you're referring to, which is connectedcomedy.com. And it was a blog and newsletter designed to basically teach comedians and people who create funny content how to use social media to grow their audience. And this was around 2010-ish. At that point, I had just finished working for a comedy startup called comedy.com, and I had, grown an audience there. So now I had sort of had a lot of experience doing this. And this was my attempt to sort of take the expertise that I had and, again, go straight to this audience and sort of share it with them. And then ultimately, from a business standpoint, they would hire me to consult with them and help them figure out how to do this stuff.
Which is funny because comedians aren't exactly known for having a lot of money.
No.
Like, obviously, they're the top tier comedians, but there's probably a pretty sharp drop off after the top 1%. Where you have guys who are eking out a very middle class income.
Yeah, it was not the highest income clientele. And also then it's funny because now it seems like a no-brainer, but back then, again, 2010-ish, the world was so different. Like, a lot of them didn't even believe social media mattered or was a thing. Like, you had a group of people. You had some of whom who had sort of just ignored MySpace and the whole thing and didn't really care about it. You had another group that basically had just been burned because they built big followings on MySpace and then they evaporated because back then none of them realized they should be building an email list. So it was really interesting because there was, now it seems obvious, like every comedian is trying, setting aside whether they have money or not, like they're all trying to figure out, how do I use this stuff to grow my career? As is every, not just comedians. Like, that has become, it's funny. Like, I used to say, like, a big part of my job years ago was convincing people that social media mattered and was powerful. Now everyone thinks matters and is powerful, and it's sort of all they care about, but most people still don't have any idea how to use it. So it's sort of a different problem, but yeah, no, it was not there's not a lot of comics sitting around on mountains of cash. So not the most profitable in the world, but it was a great sort of starting point for me and and I learned a lot in figuring out how to help people grow audiences.
And so obviously you probably had a newsletter that went along with the blog, but like, how did your interest begin to shift from blogs that exist on the open web to very much more core focus on newsletters, which are a little bit more of an intimate medium?
Well, a couple things happened. So two things happened. So the first was I did that full-time sort of connected comedy blog and consulting for about a year or so. Then I was approached by my former boss at New Line Cinema, who had just gone to the Academy of Motion Pictures. And she wound up hiring me to go there and basically build out and run a digital media and marketing department for the Academy year round, and also obviously for the Oscars. So, I always joke that like if I ever wrote a book about this stuff, it would be, something about like from open micers to Oscar winners, because I went from sort of working with these comics who have no money and no resources and no audience to the biggest entertainment show on the planet and this iconic brand that has been around forever. That was happening, one of the things that I realized was a lot of these principles are the same. And that was really sort of eye-opening to me, to make me realize, like, what works for a comic with no fans, again, the underlying foundational principles, also works for the biggest entertainment brand in the world, also works for businesses and advertisers and brands and all of this. I realized sort of how universal this was. And then in terms of the sort of shift in recognizing the importance of newsletters, early on, the more I understood and realized how social media works, and also keep in mind during this time, you're seeing the shift from organic reach declining. Like, it's just very clear to me that the strongest connection you can have to an audience is an email address, like, period. I always say, like, there's a reason why Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all these social platforms default to notifications on and constantly want to email you anytime something happens. Even they know the best way to reach people is not on their platforms, but by email.
But it's just weird that it took us like that so long to rediscover email as a medium. Like, I guess we just got so distracted by social media that, like, because you would think all these truths that you're talking about now would have been evident far before social media. But like, I had a blog in the mid to early 2000s, and I didn't even have a newsletter, even though now in retrospect that would have been a great way, because I was always hoping people would either bookmark my blog or subscribe to my RSS feed. Like, I'm thinking like now, like, why wasn't I trying to get them to sign up for a newsletter? Because that would have been the best way to get them coming back to my content. But like, it didn't even occur to me at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it always seems obvious in retrospect, right? Like, I'm the same way. Like, I think back and I'm like, wow, if I would have just stayed with one blog, I went, probably a decade hopping from thing to thing, starting over. Like, if I would have just stuck with one from the beginning, like, it probably would have been better. But I also think, part of that reason is like, how do people not see it? Is that if you think about it, some of this is, it's the shiny new thing, right? There's all the hype about whatever the latest social media platform is. Email's been around forever, and it's certainly, not the sexiest. But the other thing is, each of these social platforms have entire operations promoting themselves, getting, there is no quote unquote email company, right, out there singing the praises of email with marketing campaigns and doing celebrity outreach to get them to use email, and getting TV news stations to show, oh, look at the email that so-and-so sent today. Right. Yeah. Like, and I've never, and I don't go down the political road, all that. That's not sort of my thing. But, for example, Donald Trump probably sends, or the Trump sort of organization probably sends as many emails or more than he posts tweets, but you never see them on the news, Yeah. So I think that's part of it. I think it's just, but what's really interesting is if you talk to people who really understand, professional marketers understand the value of email. The other thing about this too is it shifted, right? A few years ago, when organic reach was much higher on social media, the gap wasn't as big, right? Now, you look at something like Facebook, where organic reach is basically zero. So, it makes the difference in sort of the power of email that much stronger. The other thing I would say for me is that my degree is in journalism. I've always been a writer. I always lean towards writing. There are a lot of people that they lean towards video or audio, and email is still important, but that's certainly different. In an alternate universe where I was more inclined to do video than writing, we might be having this conversation with me talking about how YouTube is the end all be all. So some of it is that it aligned with sort of my interests and skill set as well.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying about like how social media was more public, so that's why it kind of got all of the attention. To kind of skip ahead a little bit, people keep on wondering, like I listen. So obviously, Substack is a huge platform right now with newsletters, and it just kind of like kind of came from nowhere and exploded. And now it's like what everybody in the creator space is talking about, and you're just like, and all these huge writers are now going on the Substack, and it's like, how did this become so popular so quickly? And then like I was listening to the Substack podcast the other day, and like one complaint that all the people they have come on, they're always like, oh, I wish I could do my own custom domain on Substack, but you don't allow that. And I'm wondering if like but that's part of the design, is because every time a big writer goes to Substack, people are going to, whatever that writer's name is, .substack.com. So Substack gets a lot of free publicity. When Andrew Sullivan announced that he was going to Substack, if he had gone to some platform like WordPress using like Memberful or Pico or some one of these kind of behind the scenes platforms that are completely white labeled and you're not even aware of it, they would have gotten no press and no influx of new users who are trying to kind of flock to that same platform. So it's interesting that like it's kind of by having the Substack domain name within the product, like that it's benefiting from the same kind of effects that you're speaking to with social media, is that you're more likely to notice it.
Yeah, that's it's funny. I hadn't really thought about that angle before, but I think that's a really smart, really good point. And I think those guys, the Substack guys, have been really smart about what they're doing and how they're building that. The other thing, I'm not an SEO expert, but I'm also guessing that has to be fantastic for their SEO because all those links are coming into their domain. So yeah, no, I mean it's that's definitely true. And look, they have built, if you compare it to a WordPress, a MailChimp, how many people, before this were using those platforms, but they were just, to your point, they were just sort of in the background and you never knew. So while those brands were huge, they didn't have maybe the cool factor that Substack has at the moment, or they weren't as visible. So yeah, again, I hadn't thought about that before, but I think you're probably onto something there. And whether they did that, whether that was a deliberate marketing play on their part or they stumbled into it, it's probably a good one.
Yeah, I'm actually working on an article as we speak that'll be live before this episode is live about how Tiny Letter had that cachet, that cool factor for many of the same reasons. And like MailChimp just let that die on the vine. And I'm going to be kind of exploring exactly why that happened. Anyway.
I also think Substack, just real quickly, I also think Substack, the product is good in that it speaks to the needs of a very specific sort of subsection of newsletter creators. But it really seems to me, sort of from afar, that their real core skill at this point has been their ability to do talent outreach and get people on their platform.
Yeah. I mean, Hamish McKenzie, who I've had on the podcast, he was just a monster in terms of just outreach, especially in those early days. Like, talk about just emailing every single writer who might even be a somewhat candidate for coming onto the platform. Like that, like they're so much of their success, their early success, that's now compounded and built up to today, is just that they were just so good at like community outreach.
Yep.
So going back to you, so you're starting to shift to your interest in newsletters. I think you were running various newsletters, and you kind of merged them into For the Interested. Is that how it kind of worked?
Yep, that's true. I basically had three sort of different things going that were each unique but had some overlap. One was I had a newsletter that was really just for my personal website blog that was just joshspector.com that had a few thousand people on it. I had the Connected Comedy website that was, the marketing and social media tips for comedians, and that had a few thousand people. And I had a website / newsletter that I had launched called The Person You Should Know, which is not actively updated anymore, but the site is up at apersonyoushouldknow.com. And on that one, I would just feature a different person every day who shared sort of interesting, cool stuff in these little mini profiles. So all three of those had a couple thousand subscribers. And I just realized I was spread too thin and wanted to figure out a way to kind of, could I just have one newsletter and combine these have a flexible enough format to sort of combine the three things? And that is ultimately what became For the Interested, with this format that is a combination of, I usually write one original blog post a week. So it's that, and then links and summaries to, originally it was 10, now it's basically 5 ideas a week. And the through line is it's all advice to help people better produce, promote, and profit from their creations. So I took, in some ways, what was the sort of the elements, the sort of audience growth and monetization stuff that I was doing just with comedians, expanded now to sort of all creators, which is both artistic creators as well as sort of businesses and entrepreneur types. I took that element. I took the curation element from what I had been doing in A Person You Should Know and sort of combined it, and then took my own original writing that I'd been doing on my website and combined the three into this format, and that became For the Interested. And that was, I should say too, that was like about 4 years ago. So I published it every Sunday. This week was the 215th week in a row, which is hard to believe.
And so by you use a very broad term for creators, right? Like it can be anything from a content creator to, I'm guessing, just like someone who does like artisanal pizzas or something like that, right?
Yeah. It's basically people. It's people who make things, right? It's it most tend to be, sometimes I talk about it as it's helping creative people build businesses or helping businesses get more creative. So there's kind of some overlap there. But yeah, it's purposefully a little broad.
And it's kind of like marketing focused to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because like these days I think there is no great marketing without content, and I think great content is marketing. I think content and marketing are kind of the same to a certain extent. So it definitely skews to that. Again, like when I say the sort of tagline or whatever, that produce, promote, and profit, that's sort of the stuff I talk about. So, some of the ideas are the produce piece is literally like, how do you make better stuff? So that could be everything from how do you write better blog posts to how do you make better videos to how do you create better products. The promote piece is marketing, it's audience growth, it's social media, it's all that kind of stuff. And then the profit is how do you monetize this stuff? Whether you're an artist or a comedian or a musician or a filmmaker, or whether you're running a startup or coming up with a product or a new, newsletter. I have a big audience of newsletter creators as well. How do you, again, if you take a newsletter creator as an example, you really need to develop all three of those skills. Like you need to figure out how to write a good newsletter. You need to figure out how to promote and build an audience for it. And ultimately you need to figure out how to monetize it, if that's assuming that's one of your goals.
It's funny how close your tagline is to the tagline for this podcast, which is the podcast for people who want to create, distribute, and monetize their content.
Yeah. That's why I like listening to your podcast all the time. We're in the same realm.
Uh-huh. So like one thing that strikes me when reading your newsletter is that you're mostly curating, whereas like some newsletter writers like me, we try to create content within the newsletter itself, but you do publish longer form content, but you publish it on the web and then link it from your newsletter.
Yeah.
Talk about your strategy there and what your thinking is there.
It's, I've always been a huge believer in sort of the power of curation, and think it only becomes more important. The more stuff is being created and put into the world, the more needed great curation is. So even going all the way back to like when I started out, like when, just with comics who were putting stuff, like that first blog of that time was not me saying, hey, here's a funny post I wrote. It was me going, oh, you should see this video, or you should see. So I love curation in general. And so for my newsletter, that's what I kind of view that as the core value of the newsletter. And so it's not about, my stuff is in there, and obviously they can use it's for example, my original blog post is always the first item. So I am definitely promoting my writing and driving people to that. But I'm interested, I view the product as sort of a curated product, and I want it to be, it's designed in a way that people can skim it very quickly. It's funny, you could read it and get something out of it in 5 minutes, or you could spend 5 hours with it, depending how deep you want to dive and clicking links and that kind of stuff.
And you say openly that you have over 25,000 followers for the newsletter. Talk about like your strategy for growing the newsletter's following. Like, what have you seen to be the most effective strategies?
So I definitely think original content helps. I think curated newsletters are great, and I'm obviously a big fan of them. I do think, though, if you have nothing, you certainly can grow a big audience for a curated newsletter. But I think personally, I think the blend is the easiest to grow, because the original content gives you assets that can spread and draw people in beyond just the curated stuff. But but the curated stuff also creates opportunities. Like if it's original content only, you're a little, again, it all depends what it is, but you're limited. Like the curated piece allows me to build relationships with other people, to feature their work, to share more value without, if I had to write 5 posts a week, for example, that's going to take way more time than it takes me to write 1 and curate 4. Right. But for the end user, that value, they're getting the value of 5 great articles or videos or whatever it is. So I think that I'm able to give my audience more while still having it be manageable. In terms of growth, I've done a lot of things to grow. I mean, number one is I think you have to be consistent, and I think it's a long game. I think the idea, especially when it comes to newsletters, like they're not going to grow overnight. It just takes time. I think you have to be consistent. You have to show up. I personally believe that if you want to grow a newsletter, you have to publish at least once every 2 weeks. I publish weekly. I think weekly is ideal. Depends what you're doing, obviously, and depends on the audience. I think if you go to daily, that's a lot. Like when I have conversations with people about this, I'm like, if you're gonna publish daily, there really needs to be a reason why it needs to be daily. You're talking about news of the day or whatever. Like if there's a reason, it makes sense. But in general, I like that sort of weekly frequency. If you publish monthly or sporadically, I think it is very difficult to grow. I think it's one of the other things I'm a big proponent of is, and this goes into consistency too, is you're trying to become a habit for your audience. And you can't become a habit if you're publishing at different times all the time. So even if you publish weekly, but one time it's Wednesday morning and one time it's Wednesday night and one time it's Thursday at noon, like that, you can't habitize readers when they don't know when to expect something. So mine always goes out Sunday mornings at 6 a.m. Los Angeles time. And as a result, I know it has become a habit for a lot of my readership. And, there was one time a couple of years ago where there was like a glitch or something got screwed up in the scheduling and it didn't go out. And I woke up and checked my email at like 9 a.m. So like 3 hours after it would typically be sent. And I had all these emails from people going, where's the newsletter? I didn't get the newsletter. And I was blown away. And it made me realize like, wow, like this really has become a habit. Like I have readers tell me like, oh, instead of reading the Sunday paper, this is what I read now, or I always have it with my coffee, or I have it after my Sunday yoga class, or whatever it is. And that is not, people can love your newsletter. They could love my newsletter, that kind of a relationship is not possible if you're not publishing at sort of the same times.
The other thing I've noticed with like monthly, because I've had times, not recently, but like in the past, where I got so bogged down with client work, and we'll talk about how you balance that as well. But where I like almost a whole month would go by, and I would get like a huge rush of unsubscribes. And I think what was happening was like someone, like let's say a month, you do it once a month, and somebody signs up for your newsletter on the 2nd of the month, and then you don't send the newsletter until 28 days later. That person might have forgotten who the hell you were, or even why, like that they even signed up for you. They might think you're spamming them because they're like, who is this person? Because like a lot of people, they sign up not really knowing too much about you. Maybe they just read a single issue and they're like, oh, this guy's pretty cool. I'm going to I'm going to sign up and check him out. But if you're not emailing them again within a week, they've probably even forgotten who you are and that they even opted into your newsletter.
Yeah. I mean, and I should say just in terms of growth, like, I have done, I don't now, I'm not a huge fan of Facebook at the moment, but in the past I've run Facebook ads. I've had some success with that. One quick note on that is when I've done it, I don't run ads basically just saying subscribe to this newsletter. I would run ads promoting one of my original blog posts, promoting content, and then within that have plugs for the newsletter. I've done cross promotions with other newsletter creators. That certainly can work well if it's a good match in terms of audience and stuff. But yeah, I mean, in general, it's create a good product, do it consistently, do it for a while. You start to hone in on who your audience is, where you can find them, and again, the original content helps a lot. My blog posts, I also syndicate my blog posts to Medium. Gotten a lot of subscribers from people who didn't know I existed but found it on Medium and then subscribed that way. So, it's a lot of different things.
Do you do anything to enlist the newsletter's current subscribers to help evangelize the newsletter for you? Like I've been kind of experimenting with that, where I'll even give them language that they can copy and paste in the social media and talk about how important it is to help me grow this newsletter. And, a decent number of them have actually done that. Like, do you think that there's any way, any kind of growth hack, like, I hate to use the word growth hacking, but any ways to kind of enlist your own biggest fans to help evangelize on your behalf?
I definitely think there are. I probably haven't done as much of that as I could or should. I have a subtle thing at the bottom of each newsletter that is basically like, if you want to tell someone about it, send them here to subscribe. But I don't, and I do, and I should say, like, I have had a lot of growth from word of mouth. Like people do naturally do that. And again, that goes back to sort of, it helped, the first thing is you got to have a quality product. But there are certainly referral programs and all that kind of stuff. Lead magnets, lots of people use. I am personally pretty anti lead magnet because I think you get people that subscribe because they want the lead magnet and not necessarily the newsletter. So yeah, I mean, I do think that there's opportunity to do stuff there. It is something that every once in a while I think about and I'm like, oh, I probably have the opportunity, I probably should make a more deliberate effort to try to do that. But to be honest, I haven't done much with it.
Well, you probably create like a pretty good feedback loop with your long form article. That's the first thing linked in each newsletter is that you send your subscribers to that article. Some percentage of them will then share it to that article to their social media accounts, which I'm guessing the article has a call to action to sign up for the newsletter. So it's creating that kind of feedback loop for you.
Yeah, no, it's definitely doing that. And again, like I definitely get word of mouth. And at this point have a really great loyal group of subscribers. And so yeah, I think I get a lot of the benefits of that, probably more so than you might expect, considering I don't do, I'm not doing contests to give people t-shirts if they refer enough people. You know what I mean? Like I haven't done any of that stuff really.
And so you mentioned that you published to Medium and you put the content, your long form articles behind the Medium paywall, which is like this metered paywall. And that's like a way that you monetize the newsletter, right?
Yeah. So Medium does a couple different things for me. So first of all, I should say, like, I've been posting on Medium for at least 4 years, probably. Well, more than 4 years, but at least 4 years. I'm a big fan of Medium. It is certainly not perfect, and I know it's interesting. Like, it feels like everybody's all excited about Substack these days, and a lot of people seem to be down on Medium. I am not one of those people. For me, so everything I write, both the original blog post and the newsletter, go on Medium. I get much more out of the original blog posts on Medium than I do the newsletter. Like, for example, the newsletter never gets curated, never gets featured. I get some people do discover it there, but it doesn't get nearly as much traction as the blog posts do. I have over the years built a pretty big following on Medium. I have like 34,000 followers or something like that. By no means is anywhere close to that many people actually seeing my posts there. So it's not as valuable as it seems, but technically I have 34,000 followers. And I have always, for the most part, published in my own publication there, which again is different than what most people do. Debatable whether or not that has been good or bad for me. I do it because, although I'm starting to experiment just recently with some other publications to see if I'll get more traction there. But in general, for me, the reason why I've done that is I don't, some of those publications don't allow you to sort of plug your newsletter. And so for me, a big part of syndicating the Medium is getting people, it's a way to have new audiences discover me. So if I'm going to publish it and they're going to strip out the link to my newsletter, then the only thing I'm getting out of it really is some monetization. So those other publications would have to drive a lot more views than I get on my own for it to be worth it. And up to this point, I haven't seen that that's the case, which is why I've just published in my own publication. But my blog, the blog posts I put there do get curated fairly regularly. I would say like 35 to 40% probably of my blog posts get curated, meaning featured in some way on Medium, which has been great. And so, I've made some money there. It's, it's a distribution channel and a revenue generator. I would say, like, in the past year, I think when I looked, I made between like $400 to $1,500 a month. So that is, not going to retire on that, but it's pretty good for a simple syndication channel. And I should say, like, I love Medium. I would never, all my stuff also goes on my own website. I would never solely publish on Medium. I think that's a mistake. But I do love it as a syndication channel.
Yeah, you mentioned curators, and that's basically the only way to really get good distribution on Medium. Like, I have like 9,000 followers, 9 or 10,000 followers on Medium. And when I publish posts there that aren't curated, they get like hardly any distribution whatsoever. Like, Medium is not like a standard social network like Facebook or Twitter, where it's really geared towards, sharing in a social way. Like, most of the distribution comes from curation. The only way to get curated is by putting your stuff behind the paywall. One of the reasons why I kind of stopped publishing original stuff to Medium is because I read the guidelines early on for curation, and they highly discouraged you promoting your own platforms outside of Medium, like your newsletters and stuff like that. But you have been able to do that a little bit, right? And they'll still curate your articles, even though you have a call to action to subscribe to your newsletter.
Yeah, it's a little, I will say it's a little hit or miss. Like, their curators, it's a little erratic. At times there are things that I think they're definitely going to get curated and they don't. And then there's other times that I think won't get curated and they do. So it's a little erratic. I have found, and I've had some conversations with people over there as well. So I have not, basically, as long as you don't go over the top with sort of promoting, if you're promoting products or services, I think that's a different story. But in terms of promoting your newsletter, if you just have a sort of simple call to action at the bottom of the post, from what I understand in my experience, that is not a problem. If you pepper in a bunch of plugs to newsletter, to your newsletter or whatever throughout the post, that tends to be a problem. And it's actually one of the things that's been frustrating to me, is because I write a lot of blog posts that are about how to grow your newsletter or your social media. And a lot of times I'm sharing my own experiences. So I've had posts where basically I'm plugging my newsletter by default because I'm explaining this is what I did with mine that's sort of what the post is about. And most times that stuff will not get curated. And my theory is that it's not getting curated because they think it's just promoting my own thing, which is, I guess, sort of true, but a little weird because that's the whole point.
Yeah.
the whole point of the post. So I think that, but again, my own personal experience and from sort of some conversations I've had with people there, I think if you just have a simple, not big, huge banner ad type image at the bottom, but just a simple, you can check out my newsletter here or whatever, I don't think that prevents you from getting curated.
And so what other ways do you monetize your newsletter?
So my main revenue is I work as a consultant and an audience growth strategist with a variety of clients. So for the newsletter, for me, and I don't really even use, I would say the newsletter is lead generation, but to be honest, like I rarely even talk about what I do in the newsletter. I don't have a sort of standard plug saying, oh, let's work together or contact, maybe I should, but I don't. I don't have an agency. I can only sort of work with so many people anyway. So, and I've been lucky to have a relatively steady flow of clients. So I haven't really had to use the newsletter in that way. But that said, I do get a lot of clients from the newsletter because it is a way that people discover me. And not only that, but over time, they get a sense of both my expertise, but also sort of my view in the world and how I approach things and how I see things. And that resonates with people. And a lot of those people, again, if you subscribe to a newsletter about how to grow your audience and profit from your creations, then you're looking to figure out how to do that. And that is the service I offer. So while the newsletter isn't a direct sales tool for me, it certainly is well aligned with where I ultimately make most of my money. And the one thing that has been fantastic about it is when a potential client does contact me, if they are a reader of my newsletter, I know with almost 100% certainty it's going to be a good client relationship. Unlike someone that just comes randomly from a referral or comes off the street where, you're trying to gauge, is this going to be someone I want to work with? Am I going to be able to help them? Is it going to be a good fit? With the people that come through my newsletter, I already know. They're on board with sort of how I see things, and it resonates with them, and so that has been a really cool sort of filter or way to assess potential people to work with. The other thing is, I will say, I've been experimenting over the past few years with sort of a separate paid newsletter, and I'm on a few months ago, I launched what is now the third incarnation or my third attempt at a paid newsletter. Each one has sort of gotten a little better and I've learned a little more. The one that I currently have is called This is How I Do It. And it is a weekly email where I literally just share a breakdown of exactly how I do something in my own business, content creation, etc. So, and it's a deep dive, and I just basically, this is what I do. So, whether it's how one was like, how I write emails and engage with clients and give feedback and that kind of thing. Another was, there's one that's literally how I decide what to put in my newsletter, like that whole process of sort of the content creation piece. One was how I use Twitter lists. So it's that kind of stuff. That is a paid newsletter. It is not a paid version of my For the Interested newsletter. This isn't, we might have talked about this before, but I am really of the belief now, as everyone sort of rushes into paid newsletters, that I think most people are approaching it wrong. Or I shouldn't say wrong, but maybe approaching it in a way that is unlikely to work. And what they do is, I see a lot of the paid version of their newsletter is essentially more. So you get one free issue, but if you pay, you get 3 issues a week or whatever it is. And I am increasingly, I believe that people don't want more, they want different. And that even if they love your newsletter, they don't actually want, again, with few exceptions, depending on sort of the timeliness and what you're doing with your content. But what they don't just want more emails. There's some different thing that they want. So for me, and again, my first incarnation of a paid newsletter was give them more. And, instead of getting 5 ideas each week, they get 10. And that worked okay, but ultimately it wasn't really growing. And again, I sort of moved on from it. If you look at it now, what I'm offering as a paid product is really different. Like the free one is this sort of curated ideas with one blog post from me. And then this paid product is basically you're getting a behind the scenes look at like how I run my business and how I grow my audience and that kind of thing. It is related and of interest to people who buy my free newsletter, but it's not more. It's very much different. And that's going well. I launched it about a month and a half ago. So it's still early, but I'm offering I offer it as a monthly subscription for $20 a month or an annual subscription for $120 a year. My theory and my hope was I clearly, as you can tell by that pricing, is I wanted to nudge people towards the annual. And that is what has happened. I've been really happy with that. It's almost a 2-to-1 ratio of people subscribing for annual versus monthly. So that's been really encouraging. And I feel like, again, it's still early, but I feel like I'm headed down the right path.
Yeah, I think you were the one who did email me a couple months ago because I've kind of struggled with this question myself because I launched my own paid newsletter in February, and it was just like you said, like it was just like, okay, let me just give them a little bit of extra stuff that they, just kind of a continuation of what I was offering for free. And I just never was like satisfied. Afterwards I was like, okay, is this really something that was worth paying for? And you emailed me one time and you're like, is this really what you like, is there something else you could offer that isn't just a facsimile of what you're already sending them? And it just kind of dawned on me like a month or two, like maybe a little over a month ago, that, I was looking at the people who were signing up for my paid newsletter, and I was realizing that it was just like all these industry veterans, these media entrepreneurs, and like they had like really good insights that they could share. And like I could create like almost kind of like a one-on-one focus group with them by, interacting with them directly. Like I forget who it said, but it said some famous entrepreneur type said that like in the early days of your business, do things that don't scale. And that's something that doesn't scale, is like talking to your subscribers on a one-to-one basis. So I started just kind of reaching out to them and just being like, hey, you built this awesome, business. Like one of my subscribers, she like does this annual ebook sale through her blog where she generates like $72,000 in like a 3-day period. So I was like, hey, can I just interview you and do kind of like a case study on how exactly you do this thing? So that's what my paid offering has been. It's become these like weekly case studies where I interview my own paying subscribers, which is hopefully creating at least somewhat of a feedback loop. So far it's been going well, and so that's kind of
I mean the paid newsletter thing is so much harder than most people think it is. For all sort, and you see this with sort of the rise of Substack and newsletters and a million people rushing into it. And I just think people way underestimate how hard it is. Because again, I think most people think like, oh, well, I just do, extra issues, or I lock up some of the content. By the way, this is also true of podcasts, right? Where they're like, oh, we'll give you an extra 15 minutes if you're a Patreon subscriber or whatever. And I'm not saying there's not some value there, but I do think it's harder. I think the other thing that creators don't think about when they're starting to do that is it's also challenging for the creator to then figure out, what do I make free and what do I make paid, which I think is like an ongoing kind of headache for people. right? Because you sort of want the paid stuff to be really good, but you also want you want the best stuff to be out because it can help,
Yeah.
promote and attract new people. And
And that
I think
balance is
I
hard
think that's
because you only have so
yeah,
many
it's
hours
really
in a
hard.
week and you're trying to create the best content you can. And you're like, well, I can make this paid, but then it's only going to go to X number of people. Whereas if I make it free, then it might go viral or get a lot of shares on social media, which will then lead to a new
Yep.
signups, which are people that I can convert later on to paid subscribers. So like every time you put something behind the paywall, that's like one less marketing opportunity for growing your kind of larger list.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing, it's funny. Like everybody looks at Ben Thompson and goes, "Oh, I'm gonna do the Ben Thompson for this industry or that, or not even industry, right?" They're just like, "Oh, well, I'll do what he does, and that'll work." And it's more complicated than that. And I think you're seeing, I don't know if you know Dan Runcie, who does Trapital,
No.
which is, so Trapital is a newsletter that's basically about like the business of hip hop. It is a great newsletter. Dan is a really smart guy. He has done seemingly everything right up to this point. And he recently decided to sort of shift away out of the sort of paid Ben Thompson-ish model and shift into more of a consulting model in terms of monetization and revenue. And, he checks all the boxes, like smart guy, good newsletter, a niche where there's money. And, he has connected with that industry and people working in the music industry and brands and all of that. And I don't know all the specifics of his situation, but my assumption is he got to a point where he sort of looked at it and was like, this paid version of the newsletter thing isn't quite working, right? Like there's probably a better model, and pivoted, which I think he will find both more enjoyable and probably more effective.
What do you think the long-term impact will be for platforms like Substack and Patreon that are making it easier for writers to monetize their content? Like you look at what happened with YouTube. Like YouTube was really the first platform that said, okay, we recognize that there's a lot of user generated content, and up until now, the ethos has been that like we're not gonna pay content creators on our platform. The value exchanges, we give them audience, but YouTube was the first platform to really be like, no, we're gonna share the wealth, and it just created this explosion of creators and these huge stars. And like now it's like it's a lot of hard work still. Like I'm not going to sugarcoat it as being like anybody can be, a professional YouTube creator, but it's a much more attainable career goal than a lot of other things that weren't really realistic 15, 20 years ago. What do you think that the rise of things like Substack is going to do for the writing community in terms of just like, do you think it's just like it's still only going to be these kind of 1% writers like the Ben Thompsons and the Andrew Sullivans, or do you think this is going to really kind of change the writing ecosystem?
This is not an attempt to dodge the question, but I think the short answer is both. I think both things are true. I think that, and I see, while they're different, I actually see a lot of similarities between Substack and Medium. I think the concept of, they're both at their core trying to figure out a way to help writers make money that doesn't involve advertising. And both of those things play right into a lot of my beliefs, because I think advertising for the most part is problematic because it screws up the incentives. The incentives are then about the advertiser. They're not about the audience, and you wind up with worse products and all of it. So I'm a big fan of what both Substack and Medium are at least trying to do in that respect. And I think they've both been successful to various degrees in doing that. I think, however, I think you're going to run, I do think there's going to be subscription fatigue. I think there's only so many people that are going to pay for a newsletter. And I think the people that are going to pay for a newsletter, they're only going to pay for so many newsletters. So And the economics, I mean, that's the other thing, right? In terms of like how you're choosing to monetize stuff. If you're charging $10 a month for a newsletter, you still need a lot of subscribers for that really to be a living, or to be a good living. So, it's one thing sort of as a side hustle, like for example, like, so if I make $500 a month for Medium, I'm thrilled with that as sort of ancillary revenue, right? If I'm trying to live off of writing on Medium, $500 a month is not going to be enough to do that. So I think that you're going to, there's no way all these people that are sort of rushing and starting to do this are going to ultimately be able to do it. However, some of them will. I do think I don't think the bubble has burst. I actually think we're still pretty early in terms of this kind of newsletter, independent writer, whatever you want to call it, ecosystem. One of the things that's interesting, and in some ways I'm betting on a couple of these things. So number one, like I have felt for a while that a sort of newsletter, quote unquote, newsletter boom is coming. I saw or believed a lot of people were going to move into this. I think it also has to do with organic reach on social platforms dropping. It has to do with journalism and the problems with media companies and sort of people, so I am not surprised that people are rushing into this. And now you have platforms like Substack or like Medium, like Gumroad, again, it's not just writing, but there's a lot of places, Patreon, there's a lot of places that are trying to help creators sort of independently monetize their work. One of the gaps I see, or one of the gaps that I think I'm trying to help fill is, like let's take in the case of writers or journalists, like it's not that hard to be like, I know how to be a journalist. I know how to write. I can create good stuff. I can figure out how to get myself up on Substack and get up and running, right? And write good stuff. The problem is that is only one piece of what it takes to ultimately have a successful paid newsletter.
Yeah.
And most of those people have no experience promotionally, not really. They have no real experience in terms of growing an audience. And in a lot of cases, they also have no experience or real understanding of monetization either.
And it's also just involves,
that's a massive.
It also involves, even if you're great at all those things, it involves like a ton of runway. Like you're just not going to flip a switch and have 1,000 subscribers. Like you need to be able to be churning out really high quality content on a really consistent basis for like 6 months, 12 months, 2 years before it reaches that kind of point. Like I think I've heard interviews with the Substack founders where they're like, oh, you should be like the average creator, it's going to take them 2 years to reach like a full-time income. And probably the 90-something% of creators are just not going to have that much money in the bank to last that long. So they're not, it's that runway is a big part of it.
Yeah, and the other X factor is niche, which I think a lot of people that are sort of jumping into this don't even think about, right? So they go, I'm going to follow the Ben Thompson model, but they ignore the fact that Ben Thompson was writing for an audience that not only has a lot of money, but I would guess, and I have no idea, but I would guess at least 50% or more of his paid subscribers are expensing it to their business.
Yeah.
That's really different than somebody who is, I write about the Chicago Cubs. I'm a great Chicago Cubs reporter. And like, there's a massive audience that's interested in Cubs stuff, but those people aren't going to be able to expense it. It's a totally different economic niche. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about either. I think about that a lot when I see people that are doing sort of non-businessy, and I don't mean this to, by the way, like, I don't mean this to knock it. Like I'm all for creativity and art and whatever, but in the business side of it, if you have a newsletter where you write poems or essays about your life as a father or whatever, that may be super interesting. I don't know how many people are going to be willing to pay for that.
Yeah.
Beyond, yes, some will support you and want to support you, and there is a patronage thing, and there will be some, but I don't know that is going to be able to get where you want. And that leads to sort of the other piece of this, which I know is conversations that I think you've had probably with other people on this podcast before as well, is that, there's going to be bundling. The whole bundling, unbundling thing will play out in various ways. I think that's inevitable, because it's just going to happen. I mean, again, it plays out, and it's played out in all media forever, right? Things are forever being bundled and then unbundled and bundled again. So I think that will come into play at some point in the sort of writer newsletter ecosystem as well.
Okay, Josh. Well, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find your work online?
They can, fortheinterested.com is the free newsletter. joshspector.com is my personal site. And then also I'm really active on Twitter, at jspector, Spector.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Cool. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for joining us. I'm actually on the lookout for new guests for this podcast, so if you do interesting stuff in digital content, whether you're a full-time YouTuber, a media executive, or run a cool niche newsletter, definitely reach out. My email address is simonowens@gmail.com. Okay, see you next week.